Hi, I'm Matthew Temple, and welcome to today's HAA webinar, Acing Your Interview. A couple of quick housekeeping issues before we get started. You'll see that there's a chat box on your screen. If you have any questions, please type them in. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can during the webinar, and we'll have time as well at the end. So please go ahead and chime in with questions. And in addition, if you have any other things that come up, type them in during the webinar as well. And also, the webinar will be recorded, so don't feel like you have to feverishly take notes. We'll have the recording posted within a couple days. So a little bit about my background. So I'm actually an alum. I'm class of '86, and I'm also a director for Harvard Alumni Association. So this webinar is part of what we're doing in terms of more careers and networking for alumni. My day job, I'm Director of Alumni Career and Professional Development at the Kellogg School of Management. So I've actually been coaching a lot of students and alumni around interviewing, and have worked at Harvard Business School, UCLA, and Kellogg, and also work as an executive coach where I focus on leadership, executive presence. And my background before going into coaching, I had worked in investment banking at Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank, as well as Ask.com. And we're delighted today. We've got a number of alumni from all around the world. We've got alumni from San Francisco, from Berlin, Hopkinton, and we actually have an alum from a Tesla Roadster from space, though this has not been confirmed yet. Okay, so we've got a pretty packed agenda today. We're going to go through a number of things, starting with creating your agenda and managing the interview and researching the company. We'll go through some questions that you may want to think about how to tackle during the interview. And then we'll talk about other things like maintaining your energy throughout the interview, managing phone and video interviews as well, and even dressing for success. So why don't we jump right in? So the first part, when you think about getting ready for an interview, is it's really important that you create your agenda. You want to go into that interview with an agenda of what you want to get across. And that's really important for a couple of reasons. Many of the people who are actually going to be interviewing you aren't actually very good at this. It turns out it's not actually what they do, and they typically haven't really prepared for it. So it's vitally important that you go into that interview with an agenda of what it is you want to get across. And there's two really big components to think about as you're creating your interview agenda. The first part focuses on preparation, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but there's several factors that go into preparing for that interview. So you may want to do some informational interviewing ahead of time to find out a little bit about the company. You may want to network with other alumni. So it's a great idea in terms of tapping into the Harvard Alumni Directory to look for alumni who might be working at a company. You want to think a little bit about your elevator pitch. What is unique about you? What is going to differentiate you, and what might be kind of a quick pitch? You're going to want to review your resume to make sure that you're highlighting many of the skills on your resume when you're in that interview. We're going to talk a little bit about a sell sheet, which you may not be familiar with, and I'll talk about how you want to approach a sell sheet, what you might even put on it. Also, another really big part about interviewing today is make sure that you're leveraging LinkedIn. You want to look up who you may be meeting with to find out their background as well. The other part that's going to be important is really understanding that job description. So what are some of the company details? What are some of the really important qualifications that they might be looking for, some of the responsibilities? And we're really going to go in depth on how do you want to conduct research on the company. Those two things combined will really help you create your interview agenda. And the way that you almost want to think about it is, think about a politician who might be going on Meet the Press. They kind of have an agenda. They have talking points that they're going to get across, even sometimes when those questions aren't being asked. And remember, that's probably one of the big takeaways I want you to think about. It's up to you to get your points across. They may not ask the right questions, but there's certain points that you need to get across, whether they ask that specific question or not. Okay, so let's go to our next slide. And essentially when you think about this, so this is very calming. You're seeing a Japanese bridge here in a garden. You're really trying to build a bridge from your skills to their needs and their requirements. And that's essentially what you're trying to do in that interview. And if we stay with that bridge imagery, one of the other things you're really trying to do in that interview is you're trying to establish rapport between you and the interviewer. And this becomes really important in an interview. And so when you think about, if I'm an employer and I'm hiring someone, there's probably two big things I'm looking at. One of the things that I'm looking at is this person qualified? Do they have the skills? Do they have the experiences that I'm going to be looking for? And I can probably solve for a lot of that by looking through the resume and the relevant experience. And I'm going to solve for even more of that in the interview. But one part I may not be able to solve for from the resume is, do I like this person? We'll probably be spending a lot of time together, and you get to this sort of the proverbial, is this someone I want to be stuck with at an airport? And that's really what the interview serves. You're really trying to establish rapport. If you're in an interview and you walk out and you say, you know, it didn't even feel like an interview, it felt like a conversation, you've really done a great job of establishing rapport and essentially building a bridge to that interviewer. So let's start first with researching the company. And the reason that I'm going to spend a lot of time on this, so a lot of people will spend a lot of time and a lot of energy trying just to get the interview, and then they really won't spend as much time really preparing for the interview. It can be so hard to get the interview, you really want to capitalize on that and spend a lot of time preparing for that interview and conducting research. And I think this is where you can really differentiate yourself from other candidates. So I like people to look at a number of things. And for this example, let's say we're researching a company, let's take Disney as an example. So you may want to start with industry trends. What are some of the trends going on in the industry? And if you look at a big company like Disney, there can be a lot of trends because they own, you know, ABC and television stations, and they own movie studios, and they own theme parks, and they own ESPN, and they own travel companies, and now they're buying all of Fox for about $66 billion. So what are the trends even within some of their subcomponents as well as certain industries? You want to look at company background and recent news, and that's really easy today. You can see, you know, news alerts on their website. You can just use something like Google Alert to look. So you want to look at that. Think also about products and market share. So again, if we go back to that Disney example, what are the top-rated ABC programs? What sort of market share did Disney movies get this year? And, you know, again, you think about movies, that also includes, you know, Pixar, and includes the Star Wars series, Marvel as well. Think about things like customers, channels, and partners. Who are their main customers? Who do they partner with as well, particularly on distribution? Who are their competitors, and how do they differentiate themselves from some of their main competitors? You'll want to do a quick SWOT analysis of the company. What are some of their strengths and weaknesses? Where are their opportunities? Where are their threats? There may be a quick financial overview looking at things like share price, market cap, growth. For smaller companies, you know, let's say it's a privately held company or a startup, you're not going to have anywhere near this amount of information, but you still maybe want to looking at who are some of the founders, some of the investors, where have they been getting funding, what round of funding are they through. So obviously there's a lot more information out there on public companies than what you'll find on private companies or startups. Also make sure that you're leveraging LinkedIn. There are over 3 million companies located on LinkedIn today, and you also want to be looking for, are there potential contacts you can reach out to or network it through LinkedIn at that company. So let's also talk about going deeper on research, and not as many people do this, and this can be a really great way to sort of let the company know how interested you are, to let them know how tenacious you are and how badly you may want this job. So I've worked with some clients where they've really tried their products. So let's say, for example, I'm interviewing at Google. You want to make sure you have a Gmail account. You may want to be communicating from that Gmail account. You want to be using Google Maps and Google Pictures and, you know, a lot of, you know, maybe even a Pixel phone. But you really want to try their products. You also want to have an opinion about their products. What do you like about their products? What could be improved? So really show me that you've used those products. If it's if their items or products are in stores, you may want to conduct a couple of store visits to really look at it. So there's a great example. I was working with a client a few years ago who was actually interviewing for a role of, you know, president of international for a company that made baby strollers. So a couple things that were tougher in this case for Steve. He was single, he had no children, and he knew nothing about baby strollers. So it made it a little more challenging. So one of the first things he did, though, was he went on store visits. He went to Babies R Us. He went to Costco. He went to Target to actually look at how is the product displayed, how is it sold, who are the competitors. He actually started to interview some customers in the stores, people who were shopping for strollers. What are you looking for in this model? Why do you like this model versus that model? And he pulled it together, and it was really interesting because it really was a way for him to communicate to the company how interested he was in this role. And they said they'd never had anyone do that much research just preparing for the interview. Think as well about doing informational interviews. So leverage the Harvard Alumni Directory. So get that Harvard key. Leverage things like LinkedIn to do informational interviews with alumni. The other thing I like people to do is write out your questions ahead of time. You want to have a lot of questions to keep the conversation going. And we'll talk more about what are good specific questions to ask. So resources to consider when you're doing your industry research. So it turns out there's a building in every town called your library, and no one actually goes to this building anymore, so they'd be happy to see you. And it also turns out you may be paying taxes to support that library, so you may want to take advantage of it. And what's nice about a lot of the resources at the library is they're going to go a lot deeper with what you're going to get for free online. So whether it's S&P industry surveys, whether it's things like Forrester research or Vault and wet feet guides, those can really help give you good background in terms of the industry. And go and talk to a research librarian and tell them, you know, I'm trying to conduct research on this particular company. I've got an interview coming up. They'll give you and suggest other resources to help think about that. And in today's age, if you've got your library card, you can usually get on remotely, you know, just through the internet and access many of those resources virtually from your library. And in one or two examples that I throw out, if you're living in New York, for example, the New York Public Library has this amazing branch, the Sybil branch, Science, Industry, Business Library at 188 Madison, so Madison and 34th. They have a phenomenal Career Central in the basement where they've got a lot of resources that are free for people looking for a job or preparing for interviews to use. Also, think about company research, looking through the websites. You can listen to earnings calls. Most companies will post this on their website. That's great preparation as you're getting ready for that interview. Look at their 10K, look at their annual report. In the annual report, look specifically at the MD&A section. So MD&A stands for Management Discussion and Analysis. It's where companies are very upfront about what are some of their challenges that they might be facing. Other great resources for company research you can see below: Factiva, Data Monitor, Capital IQ is phenomenal. S&P owns that. Thomson One, and even Bloomberg. So take advantage of all of these resources as you're conducting your company research. One of the things that's going to come out of the research and as you're preparing for interviews is what I call your sell sheet. And one of the things you really want to focus on is how do you develop your sell sheet? And your sell sheet essentially is what are the 3 to 5 most important skills or experiences that you're going to use to connect with that company and connect with that interviewer. And typically, you know, so let's say you're looking at something like deal negotiation. You really want to have like 3 examples, story 1, story 2, and story 3, that really illustrate a lot of the expertise that you might have in deal negotiation. Or it could be something like market entry strategy. It's not enough to tell someone, you know, I'm a good leader or I'm very good at teamwork. You really have to convey stories that are going to convince me of how you come off as a leader or how you work more effectively with teams. If it's just sort of the word leadership, it's going to go in one ear and out the other. So tell me stories, tell me compelling stories that are going to get me to really take notice and listen. And so job-specific skills come up. And so when you think about different attributes or skills you're going to sell, some may be job-specific, and we've got some examples here. So maybe I'm interviewing for a job as an investment banker. I need to show that I've conducted due diligence or that I've managed an IPO before. And so I want to construct 2 or 3 stories around each of those job-specific skills. If I'm a product manager or I'm in marketing, I may want to have a couple of stories that show that I've done new product development or that I've built and maintained a product roadmap. Maybe I'm focused on getting funding. I need to show that I've done grant applications. For other people, it could be developing market entry strategy or even managing sales regions. One of the questions that just came in, someone actually asked, what is the best way to find those job-specific skills? Great question. So one way you can do that is look really closely at the job description. They're usually going to call out, these are some of the job-specific skills that we're looking at. Another really good resource when you're thinking about job-specific skills is look at people's LinkedIn profiles, because even within their LinkedIn profiles, they may have specific examples of some of the job-specific skills that they're looking for. Okay, the next part after job-specific skills are universal skills. And universal skills typically are going to transcend most industries and functions. And that can be really important, particularly for people that are interviewing where they may be changing function or changing industry. So things like leadership, or things like communications, or team orientation, analytical skills, problem solving. Those are universal skills, but again, show me specific things around leadership. How big have some of the teams been that you've led? Or have you had to lead global teams? Have you had to lead virtual teams? That's going to be important as well. Or think about even things like communications, for example. Communications can encompass a variety of things. It could be communicating one-on-one. It could be delivering a presentation to a large group of people. It could be communicating an email, but have, again, stories that are going to demonstrate that as well. Okay. So one of the things that's going to be really important as you're creating your sell sheet is how do you write stories that are going to be very compelling. So for example, one of the frameworks that I'll typically have people use is SAR, situation, action, result. And it's a good way for you to kind of set up and build out that story. The situation is usually going to be pretty brief. You want to quickly set up what the situation was. The action is going to help pull in the listener. And the result is really important because the result is really using data to show your results. That's what's typically going to convince them why that's important. So if we think of an example, the situation might have been the company wasn't profitable. We had a lot of, $30 million tied up in working capital, and we had over 900 different product lines. So that was the situation. So what was the action I took? The action I took was I did a profitability analysis of 900 products, and I decided to cut 40% of our products that were unprofitable. Well, what was the result? Well, the result was we had a leaner product line, working capital decreased by $25 million, and the company became profitable for the first time in 3 years. So again, that's the story I'm telling to my interviewer, they may have a similar problem and they may want to hire me to bring me in to help them solve that problem. Okay. Types of different results to highlight as you're doing your SAR stories. Talk about how did you increase sales or profit? How did you decrease costs or inefficiencies? How did you increase value? And again, that could be market cap value. How did you maybe deliver a project early and under budget? For some people, it may be being promoted early can be a great result to highlight as well. So think about different results to highlight. Typically, the 3 or 4 big areas that I'll have people focus when they're thinking about results. First one would be think about numbers, because numbers can show scale and scope. So it might be, I've managed 10 different IPOs. Or I've led teams of 50 people. So numbers can really help convey results or scope. A second one would be percentages. Sometimes the numbers might be small, but maybe you increase profitability by 30%. Maybe you increase revenue by 20%. So percentages can be helpful. And sometimes percentages are more helpful because the actual numbers might be confidential. A third way is think about dollars. So again, increase profitability by $20 million, or managed a $200,000 budget. And the final one is also think about brand names. And you can think about brands in a couple of ways. Brands might be places that you've worked, employers. It might be schools or universities like Harvard. But also it could be clients. I've worked with over 20 clients, including Ford, Toyota, General Motors. It could be channels. We sell our products in Costco, Target, Walmart. It could be partnerships. We set up partnerships with AT&T, Verizon, Sprint. It could also be platforms. We're available on iPhone or Android as well. So those can other be helpful things to highlight. Okay, so let's talk about some of the interview questions that come up. And I've got a few questions here, but there's many more as well. One of the first questions that come up is typically going to be, tell me about yourself, or take me through your resume. And I'm sure a lot of people will get that as their first interview question. So one of the reasons that comes up is often the person you're interviewing with has had no time to prepare for this interview, and it buys them a couple minutes. But it's a very good opening question. The way that I tell people to think about this, and I'm a baseball fan, I'm a pretty big Red Sox fan, you really want to think about this as a fastball down the middle of the plate that you can drive any direction you want. So when you think about that, tell me about yourself, I think for most people, they will default to a chronological recitation of their resume. It's just sort of the natural default. But really think through, look, I've got a little pea brain. I can only fit about 2 or 3 things into my pea brain. What are the 3 most important things you want me to remember when I walk out of the interview? Keep it simple. So what are the 3 most important things? So often I'll have people think through, again, you make sure that those 3 things, though, match up with the job description and what they're looking for. So it may be, tell me about yourself, and it might be, the first thing to know about me is I'm a leader. I've led throughout my career. I've led teams of 10 people to 300 people. I've led projects on multiple continents, and that's something I've done even when I was an undergrad, at Harvard, and I was on the rugby team. So again, it may be highlighting something like leadership, or it might be highlighting something like communication skills, where I've had to present into a number of people. So when you think about that tell me about yourself question, try to focus on what are the 3 most important things that you may be looking to communicate. If it is that more literal one, take me through your resume, the big thing I would tell you there is don't give a laundry list of everything you've done at every job. You're going to get lost in the process. So try to focus on maybe what's the one big takeaway from every job. So the first one might be, one of my first jobs, I was working as an analyst at Credit Suisse, and it really helped me build up my analytical foundation. I had to do a lot of spreadsheets and build a lot of financial models, and I'd had to do valuations on companies, 30, 40, 50 different times. And my one big takeaway from that was I really had this great analytical foundation. So that can be really important. Another really big question, why are you interested in this role? When you think about a question like that, I really like people to think about an inverted triangle. You want to start broadly and then narrow it down. And so the first part might be, here's why I'm interested in this industry. Here's why I like consulting, because I get to work with clients on really important projects. I like the variety in it. So you start maybe at that level. And then you may narrow it down to why this specific company. So why might I be interested in McKinsey or Boston Consulting Group or Bain? And then you may narrow it down further to the actual role. The role could be as an associate, or the role could even be as a knowledge expert. But what is it about that role that gets you very, very interested? And one of the questions that also came up was, what about people outside of the business sector? So whether it's research, it's still going to be very similar, though. Even when you think about research, and let's say you're going for an R&D role or something like that, you really want to still focus on what is your strengths within research and development, and why do you like it? Why are you passionate about it? That's going to be interesting as well. Another question that came up is advice for switching industries, and how should you think about that? A couple of things, particularly if you're switching industries, you're going to focus a little bit more on some of those universal skills. So things like leadership, or team orientation, or analytical skills, or communication skills. Those transcend industries and often functions, and you're going to leverage those skills a little bit more. The other thing that's going to be important if you're switching industries, though, is you have to have a compelling reason about why you're interested in that new industry. And as well, when you think about the interview, you want to be going from a positive, not leading a negative. So you don't want to say, oh, I really don't like the industry I'm in right now. It's not really that interesting. I really like this one. Tell me more, just focus on the positive. Why is this new industry more interesting to you? So we touched on some of those. When you think about describe your leadership style, that'll come up a lot of times. One of the things that I typically tell people there is try to focus, again, the rule of three. Focus on three things. So it might be, as a leader, I'm very collaborative, I'm very approachable, and I lead by example. But again, tell me a little bit about each of those. How are you approachable? How do you roll up your sleeves and lead by example? It's going to be important to talk about that as well. One of the questions that also came in, any additional tips for demonstrating job search skills for recent grads, particularly if you're looking for your first job? Absolutely. One of the things you're going to focus on is internships that you've had and experiences you've gained from that. So it may be things like, in my internship, I was in a client-facing role and learned about, how to communicate with clients and get back very quickly. So you're going to leverage internships, but you're also going to leverage a lot of the experiences that you had as an undergrad. So what were you involved in clubs, and did you have leadership roles? What excited you academically? What were you passionate about? You're going to focus on things like that. And so a lot of those same skills, the leadership, the teamwork, the analytical, you're going to be able to pull from your undergraduate experience. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about negative-based questions. And these will come up as well in an interview. So there could be things like, what is your greatest weakness? For me, it's coming up with weaknesses to this question is one of my greatest weaknesses. I'm just teasing. So there's a number of different weaknesses that come up. Or tell me about a manager you didn't like. So if you think about this first one, what is your greatest weakness? Here's sort of the needle you're threading in that example. You can't use something really trite, like, I work too hard. And I'm going to roll my eyes and say, that's great, but give me a real weakness. So don't focus on something that's, that could be trite. And also make sure that you focus on something that sounds authentic. I think authenticity is going to be really important. I have 100 of weaknesses. But if someone asks me that question, I've got to focus on something that's going to be authentic. So this is a very authentic weakness for me. I used to get so nervous if I had to deliver a presentation. So for me, if I was answering a question like that, I might start off by saying, I'm good at presenting, but when I've got to present to a very large group of 100 people, I used to get nervous. And so I really had to improve. And one of the things that I did to improve was I took a Toastmasters class, which gave me a lot of opportunities to speak to people. And as a student, I presented in a lot of times to our sections. And today I'm a much better presenter than I was 5 years ago. So it sounds very authentic. But the other thing to focus on is you really want to focus the bulk of your answer on what were the proactive steps you took to get better. So don't keep coming back to that weakness, but how did you get better? That's going to be really important. One other important thing about your greatest weakness, it can't be a fatal weakness. So if I'm, applying to work at a bank and I say, hey, numbers, they just throw me. That's my weakness. That's a fatal weakness, so you don't go there. So make sure that it's not going to be a fatal weakness when you're thinking about it. Make sure it's actually authentic as well. The other one that'll come up a lot of times, why are you leaving your job? And that will typically come up. And so the way that I tell people to think about a question like this is if you were, jotting down notes, you would write down 4 icons. The first one's going to be a plus sign, the second one's going to be a tilde, the third one's going to be a plus sign, and the fourth one is going to be an arrow going to the right. And that rubric can help you think through an answer to this question. So why are you leaving your job? First, you want to start out with a plus sign positively. It's been great working at the company the last 3 years. I've had a lot of client exposure and have really learned a lot, and it's been great. So now the tilde, and that's essentially what's not right. And here again, you're threading a needle. So you don't want to be so vague that I wonder what you're getting at. So you just say something like, the culture's not right. I'm going to come back with a lot of questions. And you also don't want to get too gory. Oh, my manager's a terror. It's awful. It's awful. So that's kind of what you're threading. Typically think about one or two things that objectively may not be right. So it might be, I really miss working in a larger company with the affiliation of working with a lot more colleagues, and I really miss that global footprint that I used to have at my previous company. So it's specific, but it's very to the point and not too deep. The third part, again, focus on the positives, but it's been great the last 3 years. I've gotten tremendous sales skills. And now the arrow going to the right is the really important part. Tell me why you're interested in this job and in this company. So you really want to bring it back to why do you want to go into this new role? Okay. And so we are getting one question. If the real reason you are leaving is a toxic environment, what's the best way to address that? That's a tougher one, and you may not want to go too deep on that. Because again, it can end up sounding negative, and so you may want to focus on, again, it could be something like, I want a bigger company or a bigger team or a global platform. You've got to be very careful with that toxic environment. But it's interesting. I was working with one client where, was working in a particular office of a company where the person running the office was very toxic, and everyone knew it. And so when he was asked that question in an interview, he didn't go there. And finally, the interviewer said, your boss is pretty toxic. And then he could talk about it, but it really wasn't a good topic to lead with because you don't know necessarily how people are going to react. If you were fired or laid off, should you bring that up? Particularly being laid off, absolutely. That's, it happens very frequently today. And I think, again, the biggest thing with something like that is be matter of fact. Don't go into a lot of details. I'll even have people sometimes just use, even parenthetical phrases like, as there was a big downturn in the printing industry. So just be very matter of fact about it, and just to say, it could be our sales were down 20%, and there were over 150 positions eliminated, even including mine. But then talk about something positive. But overall, it's been a great experience the last couple of years. These are the great skills I've gotten. And then again, the arrow going to the right. But I'm really interested in talking with you and joining this company because of X, Y, Z. So always make that transition, even from that question to here's why I'm interested in this company, rather than about the layoffs. Okay. Asking questions to differentiate yourself. This is really interesting, and I think a lot of people don't do a very good job with this. So earlier, in the presentation, I talk about it's important to become prepared with more questions than you think you'll need. I think it's fine to write it down on a sheet of paper and bring it in. It shows me you've done that work ahead of time. It keeps you sharp. I think that's fine. But, you may want to have 10 or 12 questions coming in. Demonstrate your interest in the job and the company. That's going to be important as well. But ask questions to show that you've done your research. So a couple of examples here in the first one. I understand you're expanding into the organics market and just landed Whole Foods as a customer. What other stores are you targeting? I love that. It shows that you've done research on the company. It shows that you're up on who their new customer is. That's a much more specific question and can really differentiate you. A lot of times people are going to ask, what's the culture like? And that's okay, but it's a pretty generic question that you can ask for anyone. So go a little deeper and show me you've done the research. And so, maybe a better way to ask that culture question might even be something like, the company has a reputation of being entrepreneurial. How do you think that shapes the culture within the company? Or how does that differentiate you from this other traditional company? So make that more specific. All right, so the best interview question ever. So I was doing a mock interview with a student, this was some years ago, who was really interested in working at Mattel. And what was interesting about that was he'd done his research, we're doing the mock interview, and then during the interview he said, okay, if you had a magic wand and could make one of the following two problems go away, would it be one, the fact that Mattel sells 70% of its toys to Target, Amazon, and Costco, or 2, the fact that age compression is hurting Mattel because boys and girls above the age of 11 don't actually buy toys anymore. It's only video games. So that was an amazing question, because in that one question, that person demonstrated that he knew the 2 biggest issues facing the company: industry consolidation and just changing to a new genre of toys, and really, really differentiated himself. But you know, that question didn't just come up. He did a lot of research to get to that question. And I actually said, if they don't give you an offer, call me and I will call the company and tell them they're making a huge mistake, because it really, really differentiated himself. One of the other questions that came up: how do you deal with inappropriate questions, particularly around race and age? You don't answer them. You know, I don't think you, I think it's fair to say, you know, that's questions not really, you know, appropriate. And I think you can just leave it at that, but you don't need to answer a question like that. There's other questions, and it's interesting, there's other things that have come up around questions that are now illegal that vary state by state. So in California now, I think as of January 1, it is illegal to ask salary information. I think it may be illegal in, maybe now even in Massachusetts, I think in DC, in New York as well. So again, do your research on that, because asking questions about salary and comp is not legal now in certain places, and you'll see that grow over the next couple of years. And again, you want to be nuanced in your answer. You know, you don't want to just throw it back in their face, but I think it's fair to say, well, you know, actually that's not, you know, that question isn't really appropriate anymore now that the law has changed, and just leave it at that. Another question that came up: how do you speak to gaps on your resume? There are going to be some gaps, and again, I think the biggest thing is don't get defensive about it. I've worked a lot with parents, particularly, let's say, moms who are re-entering the workforce. They may have taken a number of years off to raise a family and now are re-entering the workforce. And I've worked with fathers doing that as well. And I think the big issue with that is don't get defensive about the gap. Address it head on, but don't be defensive. And you might say something like, you know, I've taken the last 10 years off to raise my children, and it's been great. They're older now. They don't even want to spend time with me anymore, and they're in school. And now I'm really looking to re-enter the workforce. You know, this was the industry I worked in before. I've kept up with it. I've taken classes. I'm very excited to go back in. And then again, transition to, why are you interested in that company and that role? So own it, but don't get defensive. And the biggest issue as well is just tell me that the issue's solved for it. The kids are older and, you know, they're on their own and it's not an issue anymore. Or it could be the kids are younger and we have daycare. Okay, closing the interview. A lot of people don't do a very good job with this. And I think what happens a lot of times with closing the interview, you know, you're selling. You want to convey your interest. You want to convey your enthusiasm. And you really want to close the interview. You know, one of the things when I'm looking at who am I going to hire, I want to hire the person who's most interested in the job. And so you're selling, and that's okay. I think the other thing that people do as they're closing the interview is they typically speed up. And what I actually want you to do is slow down. This isn't a marathon. You know, slow down a little bit. And there's typically 4 things I want people to convey when they're closing the interview. And the first thing is thank the interviewer. Just thank them for spending time and meeting with you today. You might even say, I'm even more interested in this role than when I walked in the door. The second thing, reiterate, you know, why you're interested in the job. And so that may be, you know, I'm really interested in your company and it's growing, and I think this role I could really help contribute and make this product great. So reiterate your interest. The third thing, tell me how you're going to hit the ground running. So it might be, you know, I've worked on over 20 different grant applications. I'm very familiar with writing grant applications, and I know I could hit the ground running. And then the fourth thing, essentially ask about next steps. You know, I'm really interested. What's the next step? In some cases, they may preempt you and tell you what next steps are, and then you don't need to ask about it. But those essentially are the 4 things I want you to do at the close of the interview. I think for a lot of people, they're very uncomfortable with selling, and they may end that interview or they may speed up, but slow down. And even to close that interview, to go through all 4 of those things, it really may only take 30 seconds, 35 seconds. Don't feel you have to do it in 5 seconds. You can take up to 30 seconds to do it, but that becomes really important as well. Okay, avoiding common mistakes. So one of the mistakes that comes up a lot of times is using we too much instead of I. You want to have some we. You want to show that you've worked in teams. That's going to be important. You don't want me to think you've got too big of an ego, but you do have to talk about I as well. So think about what are some of the things that you've contributed. If I'm asking that question about, tell me about your leadership style, that has to be much more of I than we. And so, be careful about that, because there's a balance between the two, but you don't want too much we. A second thing that'll come up, vague, hypothetical, or rambling answers. Get to the point. The other thing that happens in that interview is listen really carefully to the question they're asking. Don't feel that you have to jump in right away, but really focus your answers. Don't be rambling. This becomes even more important on a phone interview, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute here. Poor listening skills. So again, jumping in too quickly, not focusing on the result of the story. And this is why you want to prep ahead of time. This is why you want to write down your stories in that SAR methodology, situation, action, result. But it's really the result in the end that's going to pull me in, because you want me to think I've got that same issue. I want to hire you to solve that same issue that I have. And then finally, not addressing the question you've been asked. You do have to, address what it is they're asking. One of the other questions that just came in from previous slide, what if you can't think of an example in response to a behavioral question? Tell me about a time. That can happen. You definitely want to think of examples for a number of things. Let's say I'm interviewing with an advertising firm. I really should have several examples of how I am creative. But if you are totally thrown by a question, again, don't hesitate. Even if you had to take 10, 12 seconds to think of an answer, take your time and think of a good answer versus jumping in with a not so good answer. And even if it was a little longer than 10 seconds, that's fine as well. Again, if someone asked me, show how I'm creative, and let's say I wasn't interviewing for a role that has creative, I'll probably need a little bit more time to think about that. Okay. Maintaining your energy. That becomes really important today. It's not uncommon for people, maybe for that final round of interview, to spend 6-7 hours at a company meeting a variety of people. That's a marathon. So I'm going to tell you some things, and some of them are fairly obvious, but you forget them. Make sure you know the schedule ahead of time. Ask for it, and don't ask the day before. You may want to ask, a week out, could you send me the schedule, particularly with some of the interviewer names, so I can conduct, just prep for it. And if the response is, well, it's not finalized yet, you might say, that's okay. Even if it's just a draft and it's going to change, send me that draft copy now, so you can, you don't want to suddenly get it the night before when you're flying in for the interview. Allow a lot more time to get to the interview than you think. I live in LA. It could take days to get to an interview. You really, you don't want to be sweating there as you arrive at the interview because there was a pileup on the 405. And you may not be familiar with that commuting pattern. Make sure you're allowing a lot more time. And even if you're looking at something like Google Maps, map it out for that time of day, because driving, to an interview at 9 a.m. is very different than driving at noon in LA. Take an Uber. You'll be more relaxed as well. Don't hesitate to ask for water or bio breaks. Again, you want to be at your best, and they don't, again, the person you're meeting with, you might just be meeting with for that 1 hour. They don't realize you're on a 6-hour treadmill, so don't be afraid to ask for water or bio breaks. I like people to bring a small snack like almonds, which is good protein. It's going to keep your sugar at a decent level rather than eating something sugary or sweet. It's a marathon. Get a good night's sleep before that. I know, again, I'm Captain Obvious here, but again, getting sleep is going to keep you at your best versus staying up, spending a couple more hours prepping for the interview. Okay, so one of the questions that came in, tips for a phone interview and Skype interview. You have read my mind. We're going to get to that right now. This has become much more important today. Many of the first round and even second round interviews are going to be phone or video interviews, and you have to be really comfortable with this technology. I'm going to start first with phone interviews, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about video interviews. Okay, first thing, there are certain advantages and certain disadvantages with the phone interview. One of the advantages well, you don't have to dress up. That's always nice. One of the other advantages is you can have some crib sheets in front of you, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But there's disadvantages. It is so much more challenging to connect with people on the phone and to establish rapport. So some things I want you to prepare ahead of time, and I'm going to be a little harsh here. Barking dogs and crying children need to go outside. You got to be at your best. So, you can't, you're not going to be at your best if you're self-conscious that someone might walk in or something's going to go wrong. So really set you up for success. Second thing, stand up. I am delivering this webinar standing up. I have more energy, but more importantly, my voice projects very differently standing up versus sitting down, just how your diaphragm expands. So again, I'm a big advocate of standing up. I like people to have a big table in front of them as they're doing a phone interview. And I typically like people to have 5 or 6 sheets of paper in front of them. And again, it's 5 or 6 sheets, not 5 or 6 stacks. First thing, have a copy of your resume, have it annotated. So you can highlight certain things. You can even write in a note about why you transitioned from here to here because your boss took you with you. So have a copy of your resume. Have a copy of the job description. Again, highlight the key skills that they're looking for so you're going to be at your best. Third thing, write out your questions ahead of time. You might write out those 10 or 12 questions. You can, check them off as you ask them. Fourth thing, I like people to have a 1-page overview of the company in front of them. Again, it's 1 page. It's not 50 pages of research, where you're going to have a lot of the things I had in that first slide about product share and market cap and recent news and announcements and products and SWOT analysis. And just the process of putting it on 1 page will put all of the information up here, which is really important. A fifth thing to have in front of you, have your sell sheet. What are the 4 or 5 big skills and experiences you're selling? What are your 3 stories for each? You can mark them off. It'll keep you very crisp. Okay, now what about video interviews? So typically, it's going to be on Skype. It's going to be on FaceTime. If you're interviewing in an industry where they dress up, then you dress up. When I've had to do video interviews before, and I was the interviewee, and it was with a company that was, again, more conservative and people dressed up, I dressed up. So dress is important. You can wear like black sweatpants instead of normal dress pants, but you got to be dressed up from here up. Second thing, lighting becomes really important. So I've got a whole team here at Hauser that are lighting me beautiful, but I don't know if they're going to be there for my Skype interview. Make sure you have frontal lighting. You don't want to be a silhouette. Even if it's just a simple lamp in front of you, make sure, and test it ahead of time. I work, in a room where there's a window behind me. I'm silhouetted, so even when I'm jumping on a video call for work, I make sure I've got that light on in front of me. That's going to be important. You can't have notes and crib sheets in front of you. You might be able to have one, piece of paper, but you can't be going through paper when you're doing that. The other thing as well is, and again, this is why it's a good idea to test it ahead of time. Look at your background. So for me, they're going to know I'm a Red Sox fan. They're going to see a Red Sox pennant there. That's fine. You wouldn't want to work for a Yankees fan anyway. But know what's going to be in that camera view when you're getting. And practice. Practice with a friend, practice with someone else. This is really important today because that is often going to be your first or second question in the interview. So a couple, and I'll get to these questions a little bit. Let's finish up one or two more slides, and then we've got some questions coming in. Again, keep typing in questions because we're going to get to questions in a minute here. Dressing for success. This is much, much harder today. It is hard to know what to dress because it really varies by industry, by function, and by geography. I live in LA. I will do a lot of presentations. So when I'm doing a presentation in London, in Hong Kong, in New York, I'm typically dressed like this. I'm going to Silicon Valley on Sunday. If I dressed like this, they would make fun of me, they would tease me, they would probably hit me. So really think through who is your audience and how do they dress, because that's really going to help you think. I think it's a really good idea. Dress up half a step better than what they're wearing. So again, I used to work at a tech startup. I wore jeans and a t-shirt to work every day, but if I was interviewing there, I would not be wearing jeans and a t-shirt, nor would I be wearing this. And so, it may be more, nice slacks and a dress shirt, but no tie, or maybe I'm putting a jacket on. So again, it's harder. Don't be afraid to ask the recruiter or network contacts there, how do people dress? So you get a good idea of how to know that. But again, that comes up a lot more today, and there's a lot more variance, so you need to think about that. Okay, enough of me blabbing. Let's get to questions, and I know we've got a couple of questions here. So one of the questions that came up, what about using humor in an interview? I like it. I think one of the nice things about using humor is, again, you can really establish rapport with the people you're talking about. It can be authentic, but be careful with it. Sometimes you're going to interview with people that are really serious. Maybe they're even German and they don't like humor. So you've got to be a little bit more careful about it. So I think it's fine to use humor once, but then see how they react. If they react and they like it and they respond in kind, that's great. You don't want to use too much. But if they kind of look serious and they don't like it, then don't go there again. So again, try to read the room first, and understand would that make sense or not. Another question that came up, at what point do you disclose a pregnancy? And it's really interesting. This just came up at work, and we had a big discussion about this the other day. Big variety of answers that came in. I don't think you should disclose it until after you've gotten the offer. You're going to have the most power and the most strength when you've gotten the offer. So I advise people not to do it. And it was really interesting. One of my friends was a year behind me at Harvard, and she was interviewing to join a medical practice and was pregnant. And I advised her not to do that, not to disclose it. And and this was a long time ago. This was 20 years ago, and things have changed. She did disclose after the interview, and they were fine with it. And she's still there 20 years later as a partner. So here's the big things I would tell you. I, in general, wouldn't disclose it until after they've made an offer. When you disclose it, have a plan. I think that's going to be really important to say, one of the things I did want to talk about is I'm pregnant, we're expecting in 6 months, but then tell me what the plan is. And it may be, I'm planning to take 6 or 8 weeks off, but we do have childcare options, and so I still would want to be working full-time after the baby. So just have that plan ready. That's going to be really important, I think. And I think it's fair to ask about, FMLA and just other leaves that they might have. One of the other questions that came up, how would you address being a job hopper? And this comes up more frequently today. It's going to vary from industry to industry and person you're interviewing with. So I work with a lot of people that work in digital agencies, advertising, and it's very common to change jobs once a year. So not a big issue there. With others, it is going to be an issue. If there's some things that were beyond your control, just say that. I really like this job. The industry went into a downturn and I was laid off, but I wasn't looking to leave. I think that's fair to talk about it. Big thing is don't get defensive about it. And again, come back and tell me, here's why I'm interested in this job. And more importantly, here's why I'm interested long term in this job. And tell me about what you're long-term career plan for being in this company and being in this industry. How do you respond to questions about being overqualified for a position? That question comes up too. And I'm going to credit the person who gave me, I think, the best response on this question ever. And it's actually a woman named Abby Kohut, who writes about interviewing and careers. Her moniker is Absolutely Abby. So when someone asks, are you overqualified for a role? The response that she gave, which I loved, was, let's say you were flying on a plane from Chicago to Boston. Would you rather have a qualified pilot or maybe an overqualified pilot like Sully Sullenberger flying that airplane? Love that answer. And I think the big thing on that question is, tell them what you bring, that you bring a certain experience. And it may even help them to think about, do I upgrade that role? I was thinking about this as a minor role, but maybe they can upgrade that role and make it better. I think also when you get that question, are you overqualified, you really have to push back and you really have to sell them on why you are better than some of the people they may be looking for. One of the other questions that came in is, how important is eye contact and body language in Skype interviews? It's really important. And it's one of the reasons why I said earlier, you can't have a bunch of sheets in front of you for that video interview because you're going to be looking down. So, you can, I think, here's the one thing you can do. You can have a Post-it note on your laptop with one reminder or with your 3 greatest skills, but that's it. You can't be looking off camera. You're going to make me nervous. So that eye contact is important. And again, even if you think about body language, you're still, look, I talk with my hands a lot. That's normal. That sort of shows interest. It breaks up the interview. I think that's fine. One of the other questions that came in, any tips for follow-up thank you emails or letters afterwards? Really, really important when you're interviewing. I think a thank you note is important. I think a thank you note can serve a couple of purposes. It can reiterate why you're interested in the role, and you can use it as a chance to highlight those skills or experiences that really qualify you. I think the other reason that it can be important is in any interview, you're going to walk away saying, I forgot to say this. So you can use it as an opportunity to say something that you may have forgotten to do in the interview earlier. The other thing that becomes really important in that thank you note is, don't write a generic thank you note. Reference 1 or 2 of the things that we talked about in that interview. I think that becomes very, very important as well. Make it very specific. It might be about that person's background. It might be about a project that person is working on that you talked about, but make it very, very specific as well. And timeliness is important. And I know this is going to sound funny. A handwritten thank you note is so uncommon today that you can really make a big impression. And there's advantages and disadvantages to it. One of the disadvantages of a handwritten thank you note is you may need a quick turnaround time, and the U.S. Postal System may not be your best option for that quick turnaround time. But you can really differentiate yourself and stand out as well. And again, think about industry. If the industry was education, I think that handwritten thank you note is more important. If the industry is technology, probably not the best option. You may want to go with a regular email. So I know we're coming up at the top of the hour. So a couple of things as we wrap up. First of all, thank you all for attending today. This has been recorded, and we will have it posted on the HAA website very soon on the YouTube page. So you'll be able to see it on YouTube, and I think we'll send out a link so you can watch it afterwards. If you have additional questions, come back. And then final things, continue to stay engaged with Harvard. So whether it's your local club or attending some of these online webinars, continue to stay engaged with the university, and you can do that in a number of ways. If you haven't gotten your Harvard key and put in your alumni information in the directory, please do that as well. You can use that as you're prepping for interviews and reaching out. And finally, as you have other ideas, either for webinars or speakers that we really want to do, as we're trying to highlight alumni talking about careers and networks, please come back to us with those suggestions. thank you very much. And a big thank you to everyone here at Hauser Studio and at HAA for making this come off, hopefully, flawlessly. Thank you.
And thank you very much.